So Len is a Ph.D. He's an assistant professor with joint appointments with the American Indian Studies Program and the Udall Center for Public Policy. In addition, he is the founder and CEO of Colorado-based outdoor apparel company NativesOutdoors. He holds a bachelor's of science in mechanical engineering from the University of Kansas and a doctorate from Carnegie Mellon University Department of Engineering and Public Policy. Previously, he worked at the NASA Glenn Research Center in Cleveland, Ohio, on a supersonic vehicle research, and most recently worked for the Department of Energy's Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs supporting tribes, realizing their energy futures through research and grant making. His research focuses at the intersection of the indigenous people and natural resource management policy. This has included work from energy and water issues in the lower 48 and Alaska to outdoor recreation management policy. In his spare time, believe it or not, Len has some spare time. He is an avid outdoor adventurer using rock ice climbing, high altitude and ski mountaineering, bike packing to convey stories focused on environmental activism and indigenous history. These adventures are documented through his writing and photography, which has been featured in The Alpinist, Outdoor Magazine, Climbing Zine, Beside Magazine, Patagonia's The Cleanest Line, and various film festivals. So Len and I were actually introduced through our buddy Sam Elias, and Gnarly and Sam had worked on a t-shirt project. Sam and I had actually worked on this like way over a year when we actually designed that shirt, and Sam designed the shirt, but the whole collab started then, and then Sam introduced me to Len, and the project ended up benefiting Natives Outdoors, and the funds were used to provide masks throughout southern I guess Arizona and Colorado primarily.
Yeah, they went to this place called Rough Rock, but yeah, they got shipped out last week.
Cool, awesome to hear that. So we're stoked to have Len lead this conversation with us today. I'm going to turn the time over to him. Len, I think that you should have the ability to manage screen share.
I do not.
1 second then.
I've been having issues with screen sharing on this. I tried to fix it, so I sent you the presentation just in case.
Try that now.
Does it, how is this? Does it go black?
Yep.
Does it go black?
It does.
Ah, okay. I just sent you the presentation, so this is how we're gonna do it.
Okay.
But yeah, thanks everyone. I'll just start while Eli's getting that queued together. Yes, I mean, it seems like I do a lot of things, but the through line, I'm actually leaving my professor job at the end of this year. So academia is kind of not a good place to be right now. But I'm planning to continue doing work in the outdoor industry and things of that sort. So that's kind of how it's shifting, but a lot of my work has focused at the intersection of indigenous peoples and the land. And part that was because I looked at, in my doctoral research, I looked at the ways in which cultural values influence our sort of relationships to the environment and the policies that we make. And so I looked at that in the context of energy, and I said, hey, this actually can apply to how we recreate outside. And I thought it would be a great opportunity just to, one, explore my own relationship with these places, but also how others do too. So some of the stories I've written, two that come to mind you can find online is there's one I wrote in The Alpinist in 71 called Water's Life, but kind of talking about the cycle of water and that significance there. And then the other is a Patagonia piece that was sort of, it's called The Summit That Never Melts, but it's about climate change in the West. Did you happen to get that, Eli?
I got it. I'm ready for you.
Great. You want to go ahead and share? Okay. So, one of the things is, when Eli and I were talking about Where do we go? How do we do this presentation? Like, have this conversation. I really just thought we should just start from the base of, how we got here, how we do the things that we do, where we do them. And much of that is in the public lands. You can go next slide. So you can keep going. I've published papers. If you want to melt your brain, you can read that paper. But part of that, looking at that cultural relationship, this was a short film that we made here called Welcome to Gwich'eghé about the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. In many ways, I call it an extension of my dissertation, in the sense that it was looking at these cultural values, how people relate to the land, and why that's important to policy. You can keep going. Next slide. Can you go down a little more?
Yep, it's
there we go. It's a little laggy. So I'm pretty new to climbing. I'm pretty new to skiing. Growing up, I didn't really have those opportunities. I went off to college. Well, I won't say I didn't. I was interested in other things. So in another life, I used to race cars. I'm a big fan of adrenaline. I'm a big fan of getting scared. And I slowly just started not really finding the car racing scene something that I really wanted to be a part of. And so I started finding other things where I could go fast or move really slowly and get scared on a rock. So I do those things now and try to write those stories. So just starting broadly, we have to answer this question first of what are tribes and who is indigenous? I think I'll more answer that first question first, but here in the United States, there's 574 federally recognized tribes. And these are tribes that have some formalized relationship with the federal government. There's also a handful of tribes that are state recognized or rather have other sorts of recognition. For the purposes of American Indians in this country, this is a really important designation because it signifies the sort of political and legal relationship that Native peoples have, both as an identity and with the federal government. I think one of the things that a pet peeve of mine is like when I hear the term BIPOC and like I'm kind of captured within that Black, Indigenous people of color, it almost erases this component of this particular identity. And I think in terms of how we talk about public lands and tribes, we have to be specific. So, and when we talk about how many people, how many of us are there in this country, it's less than 2% of the population, much of it in the West. You can look at basically Oklahoma, California, Arizona are the states that have the most indigenous populations. Next slide. So there's this term that gets thrown around, tribal sovereignty. One of the things to note is that this is the political relationship of Native peoples. Before contact, we had, thousands of years of continuous government, civilizations that existed here in this continent long before contact. At one point there was this city in just outside of St. Louis, Missouri. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's called Cahokia. Cahokia in the 1300s actually was the largest city in the world in terms of population. There's more people that live there than in Paris, but it's often a piece of history that isn't talked about much. But the point being is that when the United States came into contact and war with tribes, what ended up occurring was either treaties to stop war or to basically codify the cessation of land. And treaties are effectively, these are contracts, agreements, like agreements made between sovereign nations. When you think of a treaty, that's like US and Mexico, US and Canada, but there's also about 500 and some treaties signed between Native nations and tribes. So the United States government not having the foresight, basically, oops, we recognize these indigenous peoples as sovereign nations as a result. And that's embedded in our Constitution in Article 6, which says treaties are law of the land. So that's important, but in terms of how we relate to the federal government, it's a little different. So go to the next slide. So there's these series of Supreme Court cases. I won't go into too much detail here. You can look it up. It's called the Marshall Trilogy. But basically, the high-level view of what this was is that in the early 1800s, there was a lot of questions of how states and tribes and the federal government, like what was the relationship there? In this first part of the trilogy, Johnson versus McIntosh, the big takeaways is that, the United States government said, actually, all of this Indian land belongs to us because we discovered it and we conquered it. And this was the doctrine of discovery, which, has its roots way back in the 1400s in the Crusades, was used as legal doctrine here. We were allowed to continue to live on the land, but more importantly, the Indian land that we lived on couldn't be bought or sold unless there was some sort of action by the federal government. So in many ways, we had that taken away pretty quickly. Next slide. The next is this court case, the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. Long story short, the state of Georgia was trying to impose its state laws on tribal lands. The tribe said, you can't do that, we're a sovereign nation. What the federal government ended up saying, or what the Supreme Court ended up saying, is that actually, yeah, state laws aren't in effect on tribal land. Or sorry, Native nations are not sovereign nations in the sense of like a foreign nation like Canada or Mexico, but we kind of fall into this weird category called domestic dependent nations. And the language that was used in that court case was defining us as a guardian and a ward, because there was a common belief at that time that we as Native people were unable of managing our own affairs, and this had to be done by the federal government. Next slide. And the last was this Worcester versus Georgia. Similar thing, again, conflict between the state and tribes. But one of the two outcomes of this that were particularly important was that state laws don't have effect on reservation land. And this is still true today. All of these things still hold true. The other thing is that this is also where we have been defined as distinct political communities. So here in the state of Arizona, for example, how that plays out kind of in a practical way is the state currently has laws against the use of affirmative action, and say in the case of the university with like scholarships and admissions. But because Native peoples are a political class, the state can provide preference for Native peoples in that process. So there's differences there that are functionally important here. Next slide. And the big thing to note is that this is the sort of high level view. When we talk about federal public lands, as I will in the next few slides, there's this I'm very much glossing over a lot of the details, but the important thing to take away is that these court cases, these treaties, all of these things that precede us in the past 250 years form what is known as a government to government relationship between tribes and the federal government. I, as an individual tribal citizen, can't represent my tribe. We have elected leadership that serves that purpose, very much the same way we can't, as individual US citizens, go and represent the United States in foreign affairs. So, but there's, one of the things that's been important to note about this relationship is that in many ways, there's a characterization of treaty obligations, trust responsibility agreements as these sorts of handouts given to Native peoples. I'd almost like to reframe that in the sense these are appropriations as rent due for the land that's being occupied by this country. So we'll go next slide. So one of the things that I always say is like this stuff still matters today. We've had two pretty significant Supreme Court cases in the recent past 2 years that really enforce tribes as Native nations. If you want to look up this more, this is called Herrera versus Wyoming. But basically, this was a tribal member saying, hunting and hunting rights off reservation still had effect because Congress didn't say otherwise. And so he was hunting on national forest land, basically took an elk, and the state of Wyoming tried to prosecute them, and the Supreme Court said, nope, state of Wyoming, you have no jurisdiction here because the treaty still has force. Next slide. And this one actually makes me laugh quite a bit. This happened over this past year, but this is Mcgirt versus Oklahoma. The case was actually heinous crime. A Creek tribal member murdered a woman and a child, and the state of Oklahoma tried to prosecute him, but what is heinous crime? He's going to jail. I hope he goes to jail. But it brought up really important questions within Oklahoma, because he argued that the state of Oklahoma didn't have any jurisdiction because the Congress hadn't extinguished basically the reservation's boundaries. So not surprisingly, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the tribe and said, yep, actually, half of Oklahoma is still Indian reservation. And Neil Gorsuch, who is considered a fairly conservative justice on the Supreme Court, was not the swing vote. He's worked a lot on Indian law issues before, but it was actually Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Ruth Bader Ginsburg had a lot of questions about the relevancy of sovereignty, et cetera. But what that means is functionally, you can go to the next slide. This entire section of Oklahoma is Indian reservation. Now, I mean, it always has been, but what that means is that by the Supreme Court's view, these treaties that were signed 200 years ago still have effect, unless Congress says otherwise. And that's the important thing to note. About these relationships between tribes and the federal government is, at the end of the day, Congress has the plenary power, as we call it. So next slide. So this is apparently just upended Oklahoma politics in a big way, but the governor of Oklahoma said this is the most important ruling to Oklahoma's future, and no doubt, because much of this area in which was now designated Indian reservation yet again is where most of the state's oil and gas revenue comes from, and now it's under the jurisdiction of tribal EPA requirements. Next slide. So what does that mean? Basically they're trying to figure it out right now, what that looks like, and right now the tribes have the upper hand. It's kind of a funny turn of events. But it's kind of funny how these things from 200 years ago show their faces in different ways. Next slide. But this is, Oklahoma's kind of a unique case. And I think one of the things, at least in our world and in sort of the things that we do, federal public lands, is kind of the ways in which we interact the most with this history. So it's important. I'll just kind of walk you through how we got here, what that looks like, and then we'll wrap up in talking about Bears Ears. So most of our federal lands are in the West. An important thing to note is that much of this land came from the removal of indigenous peoples. So there's a wonderful book, if you're interested in reading more about this, called Dispossessing the Wilderness. It's a very short book, about 150 pages, but it looks at the creation of our federal public land system and our reservation system. The Indian reservation system. And the argument that he makes there is that there had to be a creation of a Indian reservation system alongside this federal land system, because there had to be a legal and physical separation created between Native peoples and the lands that they once lived on, and also creating some sort of way to manage these newfound lands. And today, one of the things to note is that these are largely held within, four major entities within the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Department of Interior. Indian reservation land is actually shown on here as well, but it's not technically federal public lands in the way that we think of it. It's land that's managed for the benefit of Native peoples. Next slide. So federal agencies that have a role in this, of course, the Department of Interior. We've seen BLM, Fish and Wildlife Service, National Parks. Within that's also the Bureau of Indian Affairs. That's an important thing to note, is that when we look at what the Interior does, it also has a big intersection with the basically the management and relationship of Native peoples in this government to government relationship. An important thing to note is, up until I think it was like the late 1800s, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, I think it was called the Bureau of Indian Affairs, was actually under the Department of War. And that's a reflection of how Native peoples were viewed. And we'll get into why that was the case there as well. So next slide. So in this next few slides, we're going to mainly focus on national parks, but these have relevance and impact in other areas as well. Next slide. So how do we get here? How do we get these public lands? In large part, I'm sure we've heard this term before. Manifest destiny is something that's there. The roots of manifest destiny have its origins all the way back into the times of the Crusades with the Papal Bull and other sorts of foundational documents. Basically, if you want to look up the Papal Bull, but there's these things saying that like land and resources and people could be enslaved if they weren't Christians. They were sacrosands and heathens and blah, blah, blah. But in this sort of, these foundational laws from the Papal Bull actually have made their way into our legal decisions in the early 1800s. But at the time, there was this belief that Native peoples were basically standing in the way of progress. You want to go next slide? So in the expansion of the early United States, Native peoples were often sort of at the edges of this country, and many like sort of territorially at the edge of these countries, and there was a lot of warfare. But one of the things that there was politically at the time, in the early 1800s, late 1700s, generally the politics tended to fall along two lines. One was basically justification of extermination of Native peoples, encouraging violence against Native peoples. Much of the violence that was occurring in these early parts of the early days was not by the federal government directly, but instead these sort of state-sanctioned militias. So very much in the way that we saw the storming of the Capitol by folks that were egged on by the president and that didn't have any official relationship. In many ways, that was the same sort of relationship that occurred with the sort of violence against Native peoples as well. And then the other element of this, you know, go back up to the next slide, was the idea of reformation, that Native peoples and their souls were deserved of being saved, but basically they had to be erased of their culture in order to make this happen. Next slide. So, you know, in these early days, the United States was, as this early settler colonial state, was trying to establish itself. There was still, you know, the French, the Spanish, and the British were still trying to exert influence in this region of the world. One of the things I really want to highlight in this particular, in the War of 1812, which was a war between the United States and the British, the White House got burned, all these other things, is look at the two sides of the war. You see Native peoples on both sides of this conflict. And this, in many ways, defined a lot of the sort of early colonial battles that were occurring between, like, say, the French Indian War and all these other things. But one of the things that I want to particularly highlight about the War of 1812 is it was fairly formative in terms of the political leadership that we would get a few decades later, notably Andrew Jackson and folks like that, who was known as the Indian Killer. They saw, especially the tribes who sided with the British, as not to be trusted and as enemies of the state. On the left side, you see the Choctaw, Cherokee, and Creek and Seneca nations. These tribes were often deemed part of the 5 civilized tribes as well. They owned slaves. They adopted Christianity. In many ways, they were sort of more amenable, but in many regards, the experiences during this war formed what we then began seeing later in the 1800s. Next slide. So Andrew Jackson, you know, 18 years later, becomes president. But one of the things is that he was a firm believer that Native peoples needed to be exterminated from the land. And so what began happening is he began pushing for the removal of Indian peoples from the East Coast and moving them to what was known as Indian Territory, Oklahoma. That Mcgirt versus Oklahoma case, this is where its origins lie, is in the Indian Removal Act of 1830. The Cherokee nations and the 5 tribes that now live in Oklahoma were told that what lied at the end of this, what was effectively a death march from the East Coast, many people died, was a promise that they could live here in perpetuity, etc. And much of this removal is kind of complicated. Is based on the grounds that many of these militia factions sort of on the edge were perpetrating the worst violence. So basically removing Native peoples was in their best interest because it would protect them from this violence, and there was some truth to that. But the impacts were fairly devastating. Next slide. So these politics began ramping up towards the Civil War. And one of the things that happened is that with the trauma of the Civil War was a very transformative part of sort of the relationship between Native peoples and the federal government. People were tired of seeing bloodshed, and what also came from that was the U.S. military also became incredibly much more sophisticated and much more well armed. And so these politics of extermination versus reformation began to play out, but there began to be increasing more movement for reformation. One of the things that I want to point out on the right is sort of the elements of what we call the boarding school eras. Fairly traumatic, and for a lot of peoples, it was intended to erase people's cultures. And the history of that is actually fairly recent. My mom actually went to one of these. And it was, it was basically trying to stop Native kids from being Native. So anyways, we'll go to the next slide. Again, important thing to note is that there's Native peoples on both sides of this war. I mentioned before in the War of 1812 that you had those 5 tribes, the civilized tribes that were slave owners. And they, in the case of the Cherokee and the Choctaw and the Creek, this divided these communities. There's basically incredible divisions that occurred around the Civil War among these Native communities, and specifically around slavery. There were Cherokee slaveholders. There's this whole issue around what they call the freedmen and whether they're Cherokee citizens or not. But during this Indian removal and the Trail of Tears, the Cherokees actually took their slaves to Oklahoma with them. So just want to add some complexity in that history there. Next slide. But to the point being is that, in the wake of the Civil War, what we began to see is that from 1860 to 1890, this was some of the most bloody history in American history and what we define as the West. All of the markers on this map are from Indian battles that were fought. Basically acts of genocide to things like that as well. But, there was this increasing push that the United States needed to basically become a contiguous nation to effectively, sort of unite the states of California, Oregon, and Washington, Oregon that were on the coast with the, basically to the East Coast. The introduction of the Transcontinental Railroad had a massive impact as well, but also just the large movement of settlers. There was a lot of, for example, in 1862, you had this thing called the Homestead Act, which encouraged people to settle on Indian land. This created basically a land rush and a land grab. And so you see this influx of population, and then also the influx of violence. I want to highlight during this time, so I'm Navajo, so from the Arizona and New Mexico part of the world, and we actually were removed to an internment camp for about 4 years. About half of our population died during this time from starvation or disease. Next slide. Want to highlight that, it's kind of, the one of the things to note is this is Cochise Stronghold, which is an amazing place to climb. If anyone ever has interest in doing some long run out slabby climbs, this is your place. But the talk about Indian wars, the last Indian skirmish that occurred within the United States was in 1924 here in Arizona. So this history is fairly recent. There was actually a group of uncontacted, I won't say uncontacted Apaches, but Apaches that lived in very remote, isolated parts of northern Mexico that didn't basically come into contact with Mexican or American communities until the 1950s, basically outrunning some of this stuff. So this is, recent history, and especially in this parts of the world, it's still on the surface. Next slide. One thing to note is that in places like California, I would say this is an important piece to highlight. California by far has the bloodiest history of Indian removal, and that in large part is because of the gold and other mineral resources that existed within the state. California is notable though because it is, I believe, the most linguistically diverse regions in the world. You can see there that you have basically 6 different language families and hundreds of dialects of these different languages. In from basically talking about the intersection of ecosystems and language, is that languages largely form from the ecosystems in which they come from. So in many ways, these are encapsulating thousands of years of knowledge within basically an entire people's language. And this really speaks to the diversity of California and its ecosystems there. But in many regards, this also made a lot of these native peoples fairly vulnerable because many of these tribes were fairly small. Really interesting example is that in California's, ecosystem was so productive that many indigenous peoples in this part of the world didn't develop agriculture because they didn't need to. But that also meant that if they were displaced from these areas in which they've lived for thousands of years, it made them fairly vulnerable. Next slide. One of the things that, about California, why I was saying it's particularly bloody is, there was a few elements at play here. There's this book called The Other Slavery, if you're interested in reading. It's about indigenous slavery in the Americas. But in California, within the state government, there was actually state-sanctioned and legalized slavery of indigenous peoples that existed all the way up until the 1880s. And there's some examples of that occurring all the way up into the early 1900s as well. In California, one of the things is that they basically said, we don't want any Indian treaties. We want none of that here. The first civilian governor, Peter Burnett, explicitly ran, his platform was on of extermination of indigenous peoples within the state of California. And that's how he won. And what followed in the 1850s and onwards was basically him fulfilling on his policy promises. And part of where the slavery element comes into this is that there were so many indigenous peoples that were killed that many were refugees and just sort of wandering through the state, that individual California citizens could basically say, these native people, this native person is unable to manage their own affairs and I will be their guardian, their ward. And what ended up happening is a lot of native peoples were basically enslaved in California homes. This is not unique to California. If you read The Other Slavery, that occurred in the Southwest and in early colonial America as well. The scale of Indian slavery within the United States actually rivals that of African slavery. There's about 12 million African slaves and somewhere between 5 and 7 million Indian slaves. But the way in which it occurred was different, and it was not as well tracked, so we don't really know. So just important to note about California. Next slide. So I mentioned the Homestead Act, but what we saw is that as this displacement of Native people began occurring, people were killed and fleeing for their lives. Federal law encouraged the settlement of these lands by people as well. So the Homestead Act is one of these. We'll go to the next slide. The next of these was a thing called the Dawes Act. But basically, the United States government, the big takeaway from the Dawes Act here is that the federal government began trying to impose private land ownership on Native peoples. And so what they did is they sort of took the Homestead Act and said, we're going to turn these Native peoples into productive members of society. We're going to ignore their thousands of years of cultural history and the economies which have sustained them, and we're going to basically make them ranchers or farmers. So in many instances with the Dawes Act, reservation lands, the small parcels of lands that Indian peoples did have, began being chopped up and allotted up into parcels. And what eventually happened is that, basically if there was any surplus parcels, those surpluses would be sold to non-natives. So you just saw this huge erosion of the native land holdings within the state. Within the United States. Next slide. So what did that look like? Here's a great example from my reservation. It's checkerboarding. So basically, in some parts of the reservation, the United States government would take these, parcels, number them, and then they would sell the even ones to Navajo, or give them even ones to Navajos, the odd ones to whoever, basically the highest bidder. So you can see here is that the brown squares are Indian reservation land. And then within that is what we see. The red squares are what we call Indian allotment, so belonging to individual Indians. And then often these squares that are owned by the state or the Bureau of Land Management, these were often parcels that were once owned by Native people, but because they were forced into the cash economy, they had to begin paying taxes on this land within a couple years. And if you imagine, if you've never engaged with a cash economy before and you don't really understand what taxes are, it's going to be very challenging to pay them. So in many instances, this eroded a lot of reservation land all the way up until the 1930s. Next slide. But so what we began seeing in the wake of the Dawes Act and the Homestead Act was many ads like this. Ads like these would be placed into tourism ads, basically encouraging people to move west. So this was, basically in many ways where we see where we're at today. Next slide. So one of the things that is the other sort of follow-up at this point is that in the passage of the Dawes Act, the federal government began running into this question of who is Indian and how do we define that? And there's this introduction of this thing called the blood quantum. The blood quantum, there's a handful of things. Native peoples are one of the peoples that are measured by blood quantum, but the other things that are measured by blood quantum in our society are purebred dogs and racehorses. But this was and still is a measure in which the federal government and even tribes use to measure basically how your Indianness as a result. So I have a paper that shows this, but in many regards, the ways in which they assign these blood quantums was often racist and based upon basically, the darker you were, generally, the more Indian you were. And basically the more people resembled, basically the more white people were perceived, the less Indian that they would be given on those original cards. And this still plays out today and has a major impact. I won't go into that, but if you want to look into blood quantum, there's a whole series of really interesting readings there. Next slide. But at this time in the late 1800s, early 1900s, Native populations prior to 1491 were, in the millions. In the early 1800s, disease and warfare, slavery, these things that had decimated Indian populations. And there was a belief at this time that Native peoples were going to go extinct. And, rightfully so. Like, you look in the case of California, there was 300,000 Indians in the beginning of the 1800s, and at 1900 there was only 30,000 left. So you have, in any other context, that would be called genocide. And in many ways it was successful. But one of the things that you began seeing in sort of the introduction and sort of the ethos of the settler colonial state was this sort of romanticism in this idea of the wilderness. And you can see in that photo, there's that lone Indian standing there, sort of in this majestic pose next to the waterfall. I usually do that every Saturday, so I'll let you know when I'm on Instagram. But it's one of these things that it was this idea and this notion that it was like these were the people that once lived here, and now the new society comes in. But this is one of the things that we see playing out during this time. Next slide. So we have to start talking about this idea of wilderness. Wilderness is a very American notion. We've exported it to many parts of the world, but it's a very much this creation of manifest destiny, westward expansion, and basically the dispossession of Native peoples from, what arguably we have one of the most beautiful countries in the world, right? But there was this idea within a lot of Victorian and Romantic scholars that nature and people were fundamentally incompatible. that, the two could not coincide with each other. And so what we began to see is that there was a shift from this idea of, sort of the wilderness to more of these like managed, manicured parks for the benefit of people. Next slide. So John Muir, Samuel Bowles, and folks like this, basically, this extended to this idea that national parks and Indian peoples were incompatible. And this began forming a lot of what we saw in the late 1800s, early 1900s on how these parks were managed. And as you can see here, this is Samuel Bowles' words about, basically that Native peoples needed to be either given an opportunity to reform and to Christianize, to become white, or to become extinct. And that was their justification for putting Native peoples on reservations, is that it would give them the opportunity to do that. And what you also saw is there's, in many national parks today, they'll say, oh, Yellowstone was only a place that Native peoples passed through or didn't spend much time, and there's not much of a connection here. Very many ways, that sort of justification and rationalization has its roots in these ideologies. Next slide. And at the core, I think one of the things that we have to appraise about Muir, Roosevelt, and others is that there was deep-seated racism and hate towards Native people. On the other side of this, I also want to caveat that, much of this sort of dispossession of Native lands also meant that, these folks were trying to protect these places in the ways that they understood at the time, because there was a lot of industrial pressures on westward lands and Indian lands. A lot of it was getting exploited, and so there was an interest in ensuring that it was protected. But, I think in context, we have to understand that also these are complex historical figures as well. Next slide. So just kind of, I'll kind of quickly go over these, but the important thing to note is that we just see in the creation of our national park system, which comes from this thing called the Organic Act, there's no mention of Native peoples in this, no mention of their connection to this or any sort of provisions given for their connection. Next slide. And that even extends to, our Wilderness Act of 1964, arguably, one of the strongest protections we have for federal public lands, but reinforces this idea that, people never lived here. These are unpeopled landscapes, blah, 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 and just completely negates the fact that, there's many of these places have thousands of years of human history. Next slide. Okay, so we got through the hard stuff. The thing is to note is that things are changing. We're kind of living in a very dynamic time specifically around this. And I want to point that part of this is because of Bears Ears. And Deb Haaland, who's going to be our next Secretary of Interior, is going to be the first Native person to hold this role. That's significant. We've come a long way. There's still a long way to go. But I'll talk about national monuments here just quickly and where that fits in. Next slide. So one of the important acts that comes into play here, signed by Teddy Roosevelt, was the Antiquities Act. So basically, the idea between the Antiquities Act is that under the Constitution, Congress basically was given the authority to manage the resources of the federal government. But there was an understanding around the late 1800s, early 1900s that Congress couldn't move quick enough to protect landscapes from things like archaeological theft and looting. And so the Congress basically cut out some of its authority, gave it to the executive, the president, and said, here, you can now designate these things called national monuments, which will basically elevate them very quickly to levels of protection and hopefully get enough resources there to protect them in perpetuity. Next slide. So Devil's Tower, Bears Lodge was the first national monument. But one of the ones that we'll talk about here is Bears Ears, because one of the important thing is to note is that this was a monument that was actually proposed by tribes. These are the Bears Ears here, but as many of you may know, Indian Creek is a part of the Bears Ears as well. It's a very wide and varied landscape. But it's a place I grew up and spent a lot of time. So it's been really cool to kind of be on the front lines of this. Next slide. You know, the important thing to note is that in the Bears Ears region, people have been living here for 13,000 years. There's been civilizations that have existed here. Really fun fact is that there was trade routes between this part of the world and central Mexico. And so you can go to places like Chaco Canyon and others and actually find chocolate and that was in vessels, in live parrots that were brought up. Via trade routes. The Hopi people, who I am indirectly a descendant of, actually have a parrot clan and parrot kachinas. And so this speaks to like the connections and the complexity of these civilizations in this region. Much of what we see out in the Bears Ears region now, the ruins that you see here, are from the later, they call them the Pueblo period, but 1750 to 1400 AD. The Ancestral Puebloans, basically had pretty wide reach and sort of cultural reach. There's actually if you ever happen to be driving across Western Kansas, there is actually a Puebloan ruin out in Western Kansas that you can go see. But it just, there's a lot of influence that was happening in really interesting societies in this part of the world. Next slide. One of the things, though, is that many of these archaeological sites were left largely intact by the Puebloan peoples that lived there. They left them as if they were going to come back. And so in many ways, imagine leaving your house, everything in it. And, you can imagine that many of these ruins, this is how they looked. But at the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was a increasing market for antiquities and other sorts of artifacts by universities, by museums. And so in this part of the world of Bears Ears, early Mormon settlers in this part of the world tapped into that market. And that also included some native peoples as well. It's a complex part of this history. But, one of the things is that this became embedded in culture. And so in this part of the world, you can get these things known as pot hunting badges and things like that. And it became recreational outings. And it was a thing that really brought in a lot of money. And basically the market, and this included also people's bodies and stuff like that. So there was a lot of grave robbing and things that occurred as well. Next slide. One of the pieces that I'm not really talking about here is that in the early 90s, in the 1970s and the early 90s, there was a series of laws passed called the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act and Archaeological Resources Protection Act, basically a lot of laws that were passed to protect these sort of resources on public lands. One of the things that, though, is that from basically 100 years of archaeological theft, this began creating a lot of tension between the native peoples and the local Mormon communities of Blanding and others. In 2009, there was this thing called Operation Cerberus Action, but it was the largest raid of archaeological artifacts in the United States. There was something over 40,000 archaeological, artifacts recovered, and basically the FBI and the BLM and their police had to rent a warehouse in Salt Lake City to store all of this. There was 24 people indicted. It was a pretty big raid, had a pretty big impact on Blanding, but it really made the point that basically not enough was being done to protect these resources that largely existed on federal public lands. Next slide. So in wake of that, in the years following, these 5 tribes came together. My tribe, the Navajo Nation, Hopi, 2 Ute tribes, and the Pueblo of Zuni came together and said, hey, we need to do something to address this, because this is, there's a lot more people recreating, there's a lot more impact, there's an opportunity for us to work together using our status as, native nations and our unique federal relationship with the federal government to leverage this thing called the Antiquities Act. An important thing to note, though, is that a lot of these tribes don't always get along. So I can say for a fact that Navajo and Ute, we've been longtime enemies, in large part because the Ute were enslaving us and selling our kids to the Mexicans years ago. So there's some blood. But the important thing here is that we were seeing kind of the importance of working together to protecting this landscape, given the pressures that were placed on it. Because it wasn't just archaeological theft, it was energy resource development, it was mining, it was all of these other things. Next slide. So these tribes came together and began talking with the Obama administration. Sally Jewell at the time said, hey, if you're going to go down this route of proposing a national monument, you need to engage with and get the support of other user groups. And so one of the user groups that very quickly became apparent was the climbing community. Aaron Mike, who's one of our athletes at Natives Outdoors, very, 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 very strong climber. I was trying to help him up a 14. I wasn't helping him. I was belaying him. I was giving him the 14A belay yesterday. But he's, he's one of these people that is, basically is a Navajo person, is a rock climber, and was in many ways the bridge between the climbing community and the intertribal coalition. And so thus began this process of sort of beginning these negotiations of how to work together. Next slide. So President Trump was elected. At the time, I was working in the Department of Energy. I very quickly left after that. But what happened was there was this review that happened of 27 national monuments, Bears Ears being the largest, and also being the largest national monument ever designated at that point. And then also, it was also moving towards co-management with tribes, made it a very easy target. I can say the current Republican Party does not support tribal sovereignty off of tribal lands, but I want to caveat that in saying historically, the Republican Party has actually been very supportive of, more supportive and very supportive of tribal rights off reservation for quite a long time, up until like the past decade. So just an interesting change in politics, but this is one of the things that came up was this review. Next slide. So many of us know that, Bears Ears, and next slide, and also Grand Staircase, Escalante, these were basically two neighboring monuments were reduced significantly in size, 85% in some cases. Next slide. This meant that they were open for energy and mineral resource development. So when I was working at the Department of Energy, I was seeing, these folks come into our offices and asking us questions about Bears Ears and asking us things, basically information that gave us a sense that this was kind of what was behind the scenes. Next slide. Important thing to note is that much of San Juan County has relied on energy resource development dating back all the way into the late 1800s. That's uranium, that's oil and gas, that's, other sorts of mineral deposits. But you can see here, in the original monument of the Bears Ears designation, within the boundaries, there's been quite a bit of oil and gas development and also other sorts of uranium as well. And if you look outside the boundaries, again, quite a bit as well there as well. So next slide. But, in this monument reduction, you can just slowly slide through these next few slides, but these were the things that were left unprotected. So when that monument reduction occurred, places like this, Valley of the Gods, lost their protection and were basically available for leasing and other sorts of other impacts. But quite an amazing place. These are all photos from time I've spent out there. But if you, I'm sure some of you have been out in this region, but it's spectacular. Just the amount of archaeological sites within the original boundaries of the Bears Ears. There was 100,000 known archaeological sites, which, for context, that's more archaeological sites than all the national park units combined. It's significant. So one of the things that I left my job and I started working in the outdoor industry, and at the time I was talking with Patagonia, and there was just this what we saw in Salt Lake with the exodus of the outdoor retailer show from Salt Lake, in protest of what was happening with public lands. Next slide. So at the time I had just joined the Colorado Outdoor Recreation Industry Advisory Board, or for the office. I still have that role. But one of the things that we were talking about pretty early on is that, the state of Utah basically didn't really work with tribes and did a lot to undermine that sovereignty. And of course, our motto that we eventually settled on was pretty good. I thought it was catchy, but this is eventually the outdoor retailer show got moved to Denver. Next slide. But one of the things that we did at the first two shows is that we began convening in conjunction with the governor and the lieutenant governor, the outdoor rec office, and the Colorado Commission on Indian Affairs began trying to solidify and build this bridge between tribes and the outdoor industry and around this conversation of public lands. So for 2 years up until COVID, we brought together around 30 tribes from the West to have conversations with federal land managers and other sorts of things about public land management. And this was awesome. It's led to some pretty significant changes within the state of Colorado around outdoor rec management. But it's something that, at least in sort of what happened with Bears Ears, we saw that there was a really incredible value of building the relationships beyond with the outdoor industry as well. Next slide. This was a small little project that we worked on pretty early on, but raising money for the visitor center that you can now visit in Bluff, Utah, run by the Friends of Cedar Mesa. We did a big Kickstarter campaign, and it was really fun. It was really fun. It's how I got to connect with a lot of folks in the industry. It was very early on in my world, but it was this point at which it was kind of felt like this opportunity to make this change. Next slide. So where we're at today, and I'll just kind of end it here and we'll go into questions, but where we're at with Bears Ears, it's to be determined. It looks like most likely it'll be returned, but it's unclear under when the boundaries or et cetera. Basically, in order to get federal regulations to stick, you have to be very thorough and methodical, and that can take years. The lawsuits, there's 5 lawsuits originally that got combined into 2. And those are still pending, but now that the administration likely isn't going to fight them, they could easily be overturned there. The other element that's very real about this is Deb Holland, who's Laguna Pueblo, and elected representative from New Mexico, is likely to be our next Secretary of Interior. She'll be the first Native person to ever hold that role, which will be significant. And her hearings were actually over the past 2 days. And it was kind of interesting how her hearing actually became this proxy for a lot of other energy resource development questions. But, there's going to be some interesting changes there. I mean, basically her role as an Interior Secretary is pretty limited to the box that is given to her by Congress, but I think within that she'll be able to do a lot. So anyways, that's the TLDR of American Indian history and public lands. But yeah, I'm happy to talk about this, or at least other questions you may have. I mean, I recognize a lot of this stuff may be new, so like I'm totally happy to answer what may feel as a silly question. So thank you so much.
Len, thank you. That was amazing. The context in which you kind of build the presentation, well, the way that you built the presentation to create context is really illuminating. It's amazing. Thank you so much. I have multiple friends who are natives, and I get glimpses and some understanding, but I've never ever understood the history for natives. And I know it's a lot more in depth than what you cover, obviously, but really, really profound. So thank you so much. Yeah. Well, we can definitely open this up for questions. So I guess you guys do have, the ability to be able to take yourself off of mute, and Len's willing to answer any questions. If there's anybody who wants to jump on and ask a question, please unmute yourself and do so.
I have maybe it's a quick one. Okay, so going back to the second Supreme Court case you discussed, so the guy that killed 2 people didn't end up getting indicted because it was on an Indian reservation. Is that what happened? Like, what do you do? Because people that kill people probably should be in jail, right? So like,
yeah. He's either gonna go through tribal court or go through federal court.
Okay.
Basically, they said that this Oklahoma Supreme Court had no jurisdiction here, so they have to retry the case.
Okay, so like there's like a separate like tribal court. And then if like a tribal court wants to just like delegate a case like this off, like how does that work? I didn't realize there was like tribal court, which makes sense.
Yeah. This is a really good question, and also a very complex one that I'll try to distill. So in our legal system, we have certain rights that we're entitled to through the Constitution. Because tribal nations have had legal systems, governance systems since time immemorial, our legal systems largely exist outside of the context of the US Constitution. So however, caveats, acts of Congress, there's this thing called PL 280, which is this thing that gives certain states, not all, some states, the ability to have criminal jurisdiction on tribal lands. There's other states that have, there's this thing called the Violence Against Women Act that I'm sure you've heard about, but there's a big component that comes up with this because it's something like half of Native women are sexually assaulted in their lifetime, and 80 or 90% of this happens by non-natives. And the reason being is that currently currently in the wake of this thing called the Major Crimes Act, any crimes that happen on federal lands are by a non-native go to federal court. If it's a native on native, it happens in tribal court or it can go to federal court. But what's happened though is that in the wake of because of that discrepancy and that lack of clarity, and the fact that most federal like the FBI, I mean, sexual assault's very low on their list of things to prosecute. And so what's happened is that these crimes occur by non-natives on reservation lands, and the tribal governments, the only thing that they can do is they can detain that person and drive them off the reservation. They can't arrest them, and they can't prosecute them. They have to refer it to the FBI, and often it goes unprosecuted. So that's a that's a thing that exists right now, and that's because basically you have these two separate systems that exist very differently, and also the federal government doesn't recognize often the jurisdiction of this one over here. So
basically the federal government is like, FBI deal with this, and the FBI is like, I got stuff going on, and then these things just like never get dealt with.
Exactly.
CIA, I don't know, someone else. Okay, interesting. Wow, this is
mind-blowing, right? And so in 2013, that was the last fight, or 2013-14 was the last fight over the Violence Against Women Act. And largely the reason why this act was not getting passed, the Violence Against Women Act doesn't just apply to tribes. It's many other things about domestic violence, blah, blah, blah. But it was getting held up in 2013 because congressional Democrats wanted to give tribal government or tribal court systems the ability to prosecute non-natives. But the thing is that they created this like bar of these sort of things that these tribal governments had to do to basically be able to do this. And it just like, ensured all the same rights that we have. But I mean, it's just an incredibly high bar. And there's only like 2 tribes that can currently prosecute non-natives. But the thing is that they can only prosecute non-natives if that non-native individual had a longstanding relationship with the person that was assaulted. For crimes that just are, there's no relationship in place, they can't prosecute. So anyways, yeah.
I know it's probably not completely accurate at all, but there's a movie in 2017.
Oh, that one. Yeah. Wind River.
Yeah, which like kind of portrays this exact thing. It's obviously very dramatic, and it's pretty like, it's kind of a violent film somewhat, but really portrays this subject.
Yeah, I highly recommend watching that.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks, Arn.
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks. That's really interesting. Wow. Thanks so much. I had no idea. That's really interesting and scary.
Yeah. Good. Other questions?
I actually was wondering how I could acquire a recording of this, because I came in late and I really did like the build up, because you get a lot of tidbits of history and it's kind of hard putting it together to see how all this happened and where we're at. And so I would like to kind of start from the beginning if I could get a recording.
Yeah, Mitzi, I'll share it with everybody that I originally invited to participate in.
Cool, thank you.
Or anybody who's involved with Gnarly kind of internally. Yeah.
Okay, that'd be fantastic. Thanks.
Of course.
Len, it seems like there are a lot of inaccuracies in history books that kids are exposed to in school.
Yeah.
I'm curious if there's I'm sure there is motivation to change that, but is there any efforts or push or, beyond or recommendations for books that do tell an accurate story that could be a good resource for teachers or parents that are trying to, correctly educate their children about history?
Yeah, I mean, I just remember, I'll just my own personal story, how this fits in. I went to school in Kansas, and like as a child, there's a tribal college there that my parents taught at. But I was literally the only Native kid in the entire school. And I remember my second grade class just being taught this history about all Natives drink buffalo blood, and then all the kids are looking at me and I'm just like, what? We don't have buffalo. But one of the things that I notice is part of it is it's one of the rationalizations that I've heard is that this history is too brutal for children to understand. But I almost to comprehend or know how to make sense of. But one of the things that I always kind of fall back on is if you look at how Germany educates their children about the Holocaust, and very much it's just they give it to them. There's a lot of shame involved, of course, but it's the importance is that they present it for what it is. And it just calls a lot of things into question about our country and who we are and all that. But that's the political question at hand. I would say in terms of resources that are available, Dispossessing the Wilderness is a good one. I mean, it depends on the age of the child. Dispossessing the Wilderness is a very readable dissertation, but it's about public lands. The other book that I read is called The Other Slavery. And that one is very good. There's another book called American Settler Colonialism by Walter Hickson, I think is who it's by. And then there's any of the books, there's a woman called Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, and she writes a book called People's History. No, it's not the Howard Zinn book, but let me see. An Indigenous People's History of the United States. But yeah, it's I mean, I think to your point, for myself, many of these histories are complicated. And I think one of the things is, at least in piecing together, the Supreme Court cases and the relationships as sovereign nations, that's kind of a lot. It's complicated, even for the students I teach. And I think that's one of the hardest things about this history is that it's so messy.
It's so messy, and it seems like from an early age, they're taught quite the opposite story. Yeah.
Right.
So.
Thanks, Shannon.
Yeah. Len, I wanted to thank you so much for this presentation. Just personally for me, I don't know if I have so many questions, so hopefully I'll end up on one of them and land on that one. But I just wanted to share that I found it fascinating because of parallels that I see just with the different histories around the world of indigenous people, occupiers, settlers, how that culminates and the evolution, and then where we get to, and just trying to like figure out in my head what stories we can take from some of those parallels, and how do we draw conclusions about, like, do we take learnings from some of the courses that history has taken other countries or regions, conflict regions. So if you look at South Africa, for example, the integration of the two states and how that came to be, and then look at where we are in the United States along our journey, with a similar, parallel with Native Americans, and are we on a completely different journey? Are we on a parallel path? Are we on a similar path? Is it a completely different journey? The lessons we can take, and then what is that tipping point that moves conflict regions and deeply conflicted relationships between like indigenous versus the settler to reconciliation? And so just for me, also just the region that I come from in the Middle East, and seeing kind of where we're at in the US, where Germany has been, where South Africa, and I think there's so many learnings that you can share that other people, even immigrants into this country, would find so valuable to understand the history of Native American history more precisely and accurately, because the stereotypes and the characterization of the history and of the people is still very prevalent in other parts of the world. So I'm just thinking there's so much resource and value that you can add and bring to different groups of people. So thank you for all of that.
Yeah, I was just yeah, I mean, in some ways, the United States has exported its politics of settler colonialism. I mean, settler colonialism is largely something that we see from the British, and how settler colonial studies largely focuses on US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand with regards to indigenous peoples. But as you're well aware, there's places in the world where those relationships and settler colonialism is very alive and well. I think, one of the things that I see kind of at the core is the dehumanization that occurs in that process. So in a lot of, sort of the early texts of how, in many parts of this country, there was scalp bounties placed on Native peoples in places like California. So you could basically, if you brought in an Indian scalp, they would give you $5. And that's how they were dealing with the Indian problem in California. It happened here in Arizona. It's happened pretty much all over this country. We don't talk about that. And also just, I think, part of that is, I guess I try to become a sort of have the perspective of history of saying, like, we as Navajo people coming into this part of the world did some pretty terrible stuff to the indigenous peoples here. Like, it's almost a product of human history that we do these sorts of things. But I think I always like to frame this sort of stuff, and especially societies that, how do we engage with this in the future? It's like, we don't have a choice about what happened in the past, but we do have a choice about what we do when we learn about it. And I think that's where I think that framing has kind of made me feel a little bit more hopeful, and that things can change. But yeah, I mean, I think especially, one of the things I find so helpful is that there has to be relationships, communication, and dialogue built across that divide. And one of the formative experiences I had in my life was, I went to this international high school in New Mexico, and we had, I don't know, 200 students from 90 countries. And, I think going into that context and like seeing how people from around the world thought about Native peoples, it was like, where's your teepee? Where's your feather? Where's your, like, all sorts of things like that. But, one of the things that I began to see is that, these histories of dispossession and things that occur, like, were very real for, some of my roommates from Palestine and stuff, and blah, blah, blah. So, yeah.
Looks like Jason had just posted a
Oh
resource
yeah, there it is.
from your website there, Len.
Yeah.
Paula, thanks for your question. We have about 9-ish minutes left. Are there any additional questions that anybody would like to ask?
Silence.
Well, I'll ask one. Len, thanks for this really informative talk you gave. It's really some heavy lifting for us to think about. So appreciate your experience and your insights. So besides like buying one of each things on Natives Outdoors, what are some ways that like in the near term, are there any like projects or like political topics that are particularly hot at the moment that need some voices of support? And can you just point us to some of those or on top of your mind? Thanks.
I think, Deb Haaland as Interior Secretary, there's a group called NDN Collective that's been doing a lot of organizing around that. I think just keeping on top of like those sorts of issues. I don't know where everyone's located, but there's often kind of we still see these politics and things play out of basically indigenous peoples have largely been dispossessed of their landscapes or of their lands and where they've lived because of the natural resources that lie on top or below the surface One of the issues that comes to mind, so I'm working with to tell a story about Oak Flat, which is a place here in Arizona that's incredible climbing area, but it's also a place that's very significant to the Apache people from this area. It's a place where they do ceremony or puberty ceremonies and stuff like that, but it's basically going to be turned into a giant crater by a copper mine, like 2-mile wide crater, 1,000 feet deep. And and that's kind of something that just really hasn't gotten a lot of attention. I'm trying to, I cajoled Tommy Caldwell to come and go hang out with me down there, but that's just because, I think in many ways, like the way that we've approached our work is that, I showed you the numbers of how many Native people are in this country. We're like less than 2% of the population, but in many regards, like that just does not give us a critical mass in terms of being able to have a large political voice. Of course, in some states, like in Arizona and others, we can have one because we're a larger percentage of the population, but on the national stage, that's really where sort of our, sort of where we kind of really need to have allies and folks that know how to, know what's going on, know to how, where to look for, how to uplift those voices. And I would say like on this call, it's like, I gave you really the what you need to know about public lands in a big way and understanding where Native people are coming from and maybe why they're so angry. It's another thing that's at play here. But also that, this history is very recent and like the things that we're seeing in the past with like Oak Flat are continuing to happen today. And that matters and the context matters. And so, I would say, that's kind of one of the places. Oak Flat's one place, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, Bears Ears might become an issue, but even just the things in your backyard that might not seem that significant are. I would say, on our end, one of the things that the reason why I do Natives Outdoors and that work is that, I'm trying to write a different story about our sort of relationships to these places. And that's largely through sport, through adventure, because I kind of see the adventure storytelling as the way in which I can tell these hard histories in a way that's palatable or digestible to folks. So there's a piece I wrote for Climbing about the Apache Wars and stuff that happened in the Southwest a couple of years ago, and that Cochise Stronghold awesome climbing, native climbing crew, but also it was introducing this history in a way that was digestible. And I think, you know, I'm sure for a lot of you, this is your first time encountering this sort of level of detail here. And like, this is just the surface. It just like gets worse. But like, you know, the thing is that I think to like keep myself, like for my own sanity in it, it's like, I have to connect it with something that's like, I enjoy, that's tied to the landscape, but also his ability to connect across those different experiences. And so I really found that like, adventure storytelling and that sort of thing, and like tying it to these things that we do together outside is one of those ways in which we can explore these things. So yeah, I'm just laughing because I kind of realize some of the stuff that I introduce is pretty, I mean, it's heavy stuff. But you know, I think at the end of the day, it's like, now you know, so what are you going to do?
Yeah. So I have a question, kind of follow-up
Yeah.
question about that exact thing. Like, what are we gonna do now? You know, so the group of individuals obviously you're talking to today, like we all spend a decent amount of time outdoors.
Yep.
In these lands, right? That have been taken, and we enjoy it. We love it. We appreciate that, the opportunities, the experiences, and again, most of us have built our lives around access to that area, and it kind of creates some dissonance, you know. And so for us as individuals who are use and access this land, you know, it creates a little bit of like, is this so? I mean, I don't know how to even ask the question. Like, is this okay?
Yeah.
You know, like, there's a feeling of that. It's like, and should I be doing this almost? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it creates, it's hard to reconcile.
Yeah. I think, you know, like, I always frame colonization as like trying to undo decolonization, like undoing the effects of colonialism as like trying to uncook an omelet. It's like, it's been done. And, you know, I think that's, you know, within the Native community, there's a lot of split around this issue. So I'm just going to share my opinion on this. But, you know, one of the things that I say is like, this history's been done, it's happened. You know, we exist in a system now that is, you know, has deep inequities and issues around it. However, you know, in light of the larger issues that we face around climate change, around biological diversity issues, I mean, you name it, like we're going to have to work together to figure this out. And I think one of the things that I really think is important is that we as Native people have a long-standing relationship with these places. That's why we treat them and respect them the way that we do. It's almost like others should be able to do that as well, because like we're not setting the policy as we're not the dominant people in the scene anymore. But we need to have folks that are invested and care about these places as deeply as we do. And I think that the things that we do outside get us closer to that. And I think that, you know, one, we have to talk about the dialogue of what's occurred, how we got here, those things that happened, but also within that, like, we shouldn't as individuals pin all this history on our actions today, because simply we're acting within the system that's been created. And that doesn't mean that we can't take action towards changing that, and I think we should, but also realizing that what's also important within that is that we have a deep care for these landscapes that have been stewarded. And that's what really matters, in my opinion. Because if landscapes and environments are taken care of, are not destroyed, it means that, I mean, the one sort of thing I always sticks in my mind is that the same factors that lead to the extinction of a language are the same factors that lead to the extinction of a species. By, you know, habitat loss, destruction of, you know, other connections to other ecosystems. And those are, like, in many ways, that's what's threatening indigenous languages broadly. So if we can think about how we become advocates for these places, how we can care for these places, I think we'll take one step towards addressing that history. But there's a book on that list called Braiding Sweetgrass on that reading list. And literally that book is geared towards, Robin Wall Kimmerer is saying, dear settlers, it's okay for you to have a relationship with this place, and you should. And she says, you don't need to live your life having 1 foot in the canoe and 1 foot on land. Just step out. And so I would say give that book a read, and that dives into that question a lot more. And I think, yeah, I mean, there's nothing wrong with having your own personal relationship with the mountains. One of the, I'm going to drop this in the chat, but one of the, I did apparently I ski, but I did an episode with Cody Townsend's 50 project, and we actually skied Mount Tukivinivots down out of Moab. And, you know, that was a really interesting conversation with Cody, because, you know, in that I was like, okay, Cody, like, we're going to go on this trip and you're going to like do the Navajo things before we go on this mountain. So we made him like put corn pollen down and do all these things. And I said, now you need to talk to the mountain and ask for permission. And, you know, like for me, like, I'm not a very religious person. These cultural traditions are just simply to reinforce the relationships that we have, in my view. And, you know, he's like, oh, I already do that. I already just kind of talk to this place, and just, you know, for my own mental sanity. And I think that was one of the things that until that point, he didn't feel like he had the permission to even talk about that. And I think, you know, like how we relate to these places, you know, personalize it, make it your own, but like at the end of the day, like treat it as if it's your relative or someone that you care about. So anyways, you can look at that film, and that kind of touches a little bit on that. But yeah, I know exactly what you're trying to ask, and I would say read that book, Braiding Sweetgrass. It's really great.
I've come up a couple times.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you. Well, Len, again, huge thank you for the presentation overall, the conversation, the place, you know, creating a space for us to have this kind of conversation, I think is incredible. I think some of the things that I've been learning with many things that are happening in the world right now is that oftentimes, you know, some of the issues that we are battling or working on, you know, you have a knowledge that we obviously don't, in a very intimate way. But I think that a lot of the work falls on a white-bodied individual like me, who, you know, is the dominant, you know, individuals here, and we need to be having these conversations. You already have them. It's us that's not having them, right?
Yeah.
And so by you sharing, you know, the knowledge and experience you have, it opens, you know, the conversation for us, and starts to intrigue us to dive deeper.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it means so much that you're willing to create that space and explore it with us.
Yeah,
and,
of course.
and kind of empower us to go, you know, take the next steps. So thank you so much.
Yeah, and Eli, you're going to be setting the skin track every time after this for me.
Can't wait.
You're going to set the skin track for me every time after this. So
as long as whenever I start riding gravel, I can hook a bungee cord to the back of your bike or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Game on, dude.
Yeah, and you know, for anyone on this call, like always, if you have questions or things that you'd like, you know, just questions you didn't feel comfortable asking here, like I'm happy to chat on social media, chat it separately. I mean, I think the main thing is this is complex. I'm an educator. This is what I do. So I'm happy to take that time outside of this. So
yeah, dude, you did it beautifully. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to thank you for opening yourself up to that, because this is a very important topic to me. But the thing is I want to be armed with the most appropriate knowledge possible when I'm going out there and speaking to others and standing up for what I feel is so important. I want to make sure that I'm armed with the most truth possible, you know?
Yeah.
So I actually have a lot of questions, but I'm just kind of swimming right now in my thoughts and stuff. So thanks again.
Yeah, no worries. And great connecting with everyone.
Yeah.
Everyone, thank you so much. Len, again, thank you. Everyone have a great day.
Yeah, take care.
See ya.